documented the conditions that were there, discussed various options that were possible, and then came up with some ideas on how to implement those. So the main part of a railroad quiet zone is to reduce the risk index. There's a complex formula that the Federal Railroad Administration uses to determine the risk index of each crossing. It factors in the number of lanes, the number of vehicles that travel that roadway, number of trains that come in through a day, and then takes a look at those improvements that could be made. So some of the improvements, again, we talked about the 4-quadrant gates and the medians. There's another option which is called a Wayside Horn, which is a pole-mounted horn so that the train doesn't blow its own horn. It activates a wayside horn when it comes up to the crossing, and the wayside horn tends to be a more focused area of sound, which just generates it up and down the cross street, so it doesn't blow the horn. The train doesn't blow the horn all the way through there. It tends to be a little quieter, but still increases the noise downtown. So some of the crossings we looked at: 11th Street, a couple different options here, including 4-quadrant gates or the use of medians, or wayside horns. At West Boulevard, again, there are some medians at West Boulevard, so extending the medians or using median gates would be an option there. Mount Rushmore Road, either 4-quadrant gates or 3-quadrant gates with a median on the south side of the crossing. And then some other warning device upgrades, things like that. 7th Street, here right outside this building, or just off to the west of this building a little bit, would be a 4-quadrant gate. 6th Street, right outside of this building, looking at either a 4-quadrant gate or the possible closure of 6th Street, making that a pedestrian-only crossing. And also some additional median work on 6th Street as an option. 5th Street is a tough one. There's a lot of traffic. We've got Rapid Street crossing. We've got multiple tracks, so they're looking at, that would be our most expensive intersection. So upgrading the warning devices, adding some gates, and possibly doing some medians on 5th Street. 3rd Street near the courthouse, 4-quadrant gates or possible wayside horns. 2nd Street is another tricky one because of multiple rail lines, and then the access to Great Western Tire on the backside of that comes out right between the two tracks, so that access would have to be closed in either scenario, and also looking at gates or wayside horns or possibly the closure of 2nd Street. And same with 1st Street. We could either do gates and a median or actually close 1st Street itself. And then East Boulevard would have upgraded warning devices and medians installed. And then Maple Avenue's, again, a possible closure of Maple Avenue or upgrading the warning devices, or doing some median work as well. And then the Maple Avenue North would be 4-quadrant gates or medians. And the Omaha crossings were looked at, and those are extremely difficult to implement because of the width of the roadway and the light train traffic. The ones that go into the mill themselves, the train actually goes in cars first instead of the engine first, so it's backed in, so they don't even have to sound the horn because they can't really sound the horn until the engine goes through. So that one is protected with flaggers whenever the train does that, and that's a very rare instance. They do that only a couple times a month, and it's usually done at night. The east one only has a few trains a month, so that would also be very difficult to upgrade, and also with that intersection with 3rd Street complicates that, so that was eliminated from consideration for the quiet zone. So came up with about 4 different scenarios on here. There's a baseline scenario, which would be the bare minimum that would be required to implement the quiet zone. That comes in at a cost of about $3.3 million. There's the second scenario, which is the high safety, which basically is the top end of all the scenarios. It provides the most safety, but it also is the most expensive, and that comes in at about $4.4 million. And then there's a couple hybrid, cost-effective, one with some road closures, one without, and those range in price from $3.1 to about $3.7 million. And again, we did a cost effectiveness of the improvements. You can see the dollar on the right, the dollars per point of quiet zone risk index reduction. So 6th Street closure is relatively cheap. 1st Street is relatively expensive, and all the others are somewhere in between there. A couple other scenarios came in where we're looking at only including the downtown crossing. So it would be possible to basically only have the quiet zone between Mount Rushmore Road and 5th Street. And that is relatively inexpensive at $1.7 million. However, that does not address our kind of growing and redeveloping area east of 5th Street, which has a lot more residential potential and the whole residential potential of downtown itself. So that would kind of hinder that development. And Then there was a phased implementation that talked about doing it in phases, a west phase, a downtown phase, and an east phase, and broke down the cost on that. So that is something that can be done over time, over a period of years to implement this. And there's a couple scenarios, breaks it all down on the different options that you can do with each crossing in each scenario and the associated costs with that. So the next steps, we would have to do a notice of intent to the Federal Railroad Administration, the rail line, the DOT, and other stakeholders. We'd have to do a quiet zone application, and then the improvements would have to be constructed, and then you'd have to publish a notice of establishment. And depending on the type of scenario that's chosen, this could have to be reviewed every year, or every 3 years, or every 5 years by the Federal Railroad Administration. That is pretty much the gist of it. The mayor has formed a railroad quiet zone task force that has met, has reviewed this document, taken a look at all these options, and they have approved this draft report, and they are now looking at possible funding options to implement the railroad quiet zone. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Kip. Chair recognizes Richie Nordstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Very good presentation. If I may make a motion to approve the railroad quiet zone draft report.
Second.
Motion by Nordstrom, second by Modrick. All in favor?
Aye.
Any discussion?
Oh, excuse me, any
Hold,
discussion?
hold.
I'm sorry, I just want to get this meeting over, I guess. Any discussion?
I can take a hint.
No.
Mr. Harrington, personally, I'd like to see the staff come up with a recommendation to give to the full council, and plus it gives us an opportunity to review the report as well, to dive in this a little bit deeper. We've got all kinds of options in front of us that could be available, plus if the staff can work with the mayor's office to come up with a recommendation for us, and also working with the outside agencies or the nonprofits that are very interested in this, or businesses that are very interested in this. Definitely want to include them in the conversation to see if we can't, shall I say, leverage some of the potential vision fund if we qualify for that. Just so I can't make that motion, but that's the direction I'd like to have the staff pursue. So it looks like a very good report at this beginning stages of it, and I know a lot of our council members don't have the full reading just yet, so we'll need a little bit more time to educate everyone else on this project.
Sure, this will come back to you as a final report as well in another month or two. There are a couple little issues that we'd like to iron out in the draft report. There may be a few issues with the traffic counts they used, which would change the risk index calculations a little bit. Don't think it'll have too much effect on the overall report, though. But we'll work with the task force. We have a meeting later this month as well to discuss the next steps and look at some of those funding opportunities and working in that public-private partnership, or maybe going towards the vision funds.
I look forward to seeing, especially in the public-private partnership, the P3 aspect of this. It looks very promising. And I know some of the business people that are along the railroad tracks right now have to indulge that horn going through, and especially in the middle of the night when the tourists are coming into town, and they have that noted objection, and they've made that comments pretty clear on some of the review sites that they've been afforded to, and then even in some of the professional offices that we have very close to the railroad crossings. I know I've heard the feedback from those businesses as well. They like to have something done as well. So they probably could be pursued as part of the coalition, if you will, to bring forward something not only to the Vision Fund, but to the city as well. Thank you, Kip. Unless you've got some other thing that we should be aware of.
I don't believe so.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
The chair recognizes Lisa Modrick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I live far from the tracks, but I have the sound constantly in the background, and obviously our roads, our streets, crossings are so close that they pull that horn and it lingers. It's a long horn. And is that unusual to other communities, or communities going into quiet zones because of the way our street alignments are? That is something that seems like is part of the noise pollution, as you may have it, with the safety.
It seems to me that we have a slightly higher rate of crossings in a very short period of time in our downtown area than a lot of other communities do. Other communities around the region have gone to quiet zones for those specific purposes. There are currently no quiet zones in the state of South Dakota. I know the city of Aberdeen is working on one as well, but they have not implemented it at this time. So if we go ahead with this, we may be the first one in the state as well.
We like to be the first. So with that, we don't have a mention that there would be any type of railroad or federal transportation funding. Is that so? This is completely public-private on our side?
That is correct. The South Dakota Department of Transportation will not put any funding towards a railroad quiet zone, and the Federal Railroad Administration does not do that as well, and I don't believe the railroad would be willing to put any money into it either.
Are they asked to do so?
I'm sure they could be, but the railroad generally, in our discussions with them, they prefer to have the horns blowing. They feel that's the safest way possible. They would still be, in a railroad quiet zone, they would still be allowed to blow the horn if there was a safety issue, if there was a pedestrian on the tracks or a car stalled on the tracks or anything like that. They would still use their horn if they felt the need to do so.
So in the news, we've seen quite a few accidents here in these recent times, and that is with using horns. And so you mentioned that the railroad feels that the horn is safer than a quiet zone with gates. Have they said why they feel that that is safer?
That's just their policy. They prefer to blow the horn. That's all they've told us.
And then on the horn, has the sound increased as far as the decibels that they're using? It seems that they have grown louder over time.
There are federal regulations that dictate the decibel level within a range. I'm not sure where they fall in that range, but they are required to have a specific decibel level for each train horn.
Perhaps maybe when you're pulling that final, we could have an idea of what that decimal point is to make sure that we're enhancing on that, if we've got
Sure, we'll
any
take a look
echo
at that as well.
values or anything like that going on. But
Yeah, we'll work with the railroad on this as well. We've been in very close
Good.
contact with the railroad, and they've been very cooperative in helping us establish the type of improvements that would be possible at each of the crossings.
And I would hope that this would be something that we would look at in a level of importance for safety as well as for the design and our growth of our community. With the tourism along here as well, I think it's a good idea, and perhaps a phasing plan could be another option. And I like the different choices that you've given us, so I appreciate that in the study, and I look forward to seeing the final. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions too, and I'm not sure if you can answer these, but, you know, it occurs to me that we used to have railroad guards. You know, we used to have crossing guards that would come down and stop traffic, like on Mountain View. I think they used to have them there. So what happened to our crossing guards? I mean,
I cannot answer that question. I'm looking at Dale. Dale doesn't seem to think he remembers any, or we've had any. Again, Mountain View would be a state highway, so that would be something that the state
Okay.
would be have a little more information on. But generally, a lot of places do have crossing gates. We do not have any in this community, except for, I believe, on St. Patrick's Street might be the only gated crossing that we have.
well, I'm kind of old, so I remember when we used to have them. Okay, and do you have any idea what kind of nighttime trains we get? I have no idea. I mean, after dark, when they're coming through, people might be asleep. What do we got going on?
The railroad states they have between 4 and 6 trains a day generally that come through the community. Anecdotally, some of the people that live downtown say that there's much more than that. They hear a lot more, and they say they average usually 3 to 4 between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m.
3 or 4?
3 or 4 is what the people downtown say. They get woken up about 3 or 4 times a night.
And one of the reasons we're looking at a quiet zone is for the expansion of housing or residential areas in our downtown.
It would certainly make it more attractive for developers to place some housing closer to the railroad tracks in that east of Fifth area and in the downtown area. And like Ms. Modrick said, the downtown hotel owners are very interested in this as well, because they have a lot of complaints from their guests that overnight those trains wake them up and they don't get to sleep well, and that will have an effect on our tourist business, especially downtown.
I work at Racing Magpie, so I know exactly what the sound is of those trains when they go by and you're on the phone, you can't hear a thing. Wayside Horns, I don't know anything about these, but is there a community that's using these with some success, or?
Yeah, there are some communities as well. It does reduce the overall noise imprint or area that's affected by the noise, but it still does provide some noise, and it tends to be more focused down the cross streets. However, it does still provide noise downtown. It's kind of an in-between step between the full train horn blowing and the quiet zone.
Yeah, I can't imagine it being as loud as a train. Okay, that's it from me, so thank you, Mr. Harrington.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess I can go to the vote now. All in favor of approving the Rapid City Railroad Quiet Zone Draft Report, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
It passes with 1 nay from Roberts. Okay, now we go on to non-consent items, items 11 through 12. Item 11, appeal of denied exception request by Jim Letner to waive the requirement to install water main, additional pavement, curb and gutter, sidewalk, handicap ramps, and street light conduit along Creek Drive. And we go to Lisa Modrick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to motion to continue this as requested by our developer and speaker.
Second.
Motion by Modrick, second by Nordstrom. And do we have any more comments?
I do have a question. So since 11 and 12 are working together, are we able to move both of those into continuance?
We can, but we'll take them separately.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so I guess all in favor of continuing? Aye. Opposed? We continue this item until the next Public Works meeting. Item 12, appeal of denied exception request by Jim Letner to waive the requirement to install street light conduit along East St. Charles Street. And this is also been... Okay, this is moved to continue to the next Public Works meeting by Jason Solomon, second by Roberts. All in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? And both of these issues are continued until our next Public Works. Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Motion to adjourn by Solomon, second by Nordstrom. All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned.